all their counsels to the achievement of thy glory, the good of thy church, and the safety, honor, and welfare of our people. All this we ask in the name of Jesus Christ, O most blessed Lord and Savior. Amen. Amen. O Lord, our God, who art the lover of justice and truth, give thy grace to our Parliament and to all who direct the affairs of our nation, and guide them by thy Holy Spirit, we beseech thee, that by thy word and deed they may promote the well-being of this people and set forward peace among all men. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ and the fellowship of the Holy Ghost be with us all, now and forevermore. Amen.
The Senate is in session.
Messages from Her Excellency, the President. Announcements by Your Honor, the President.
We have announcements. We have indications of absence from Senator Tate and from our chaplain, and indications of late arrival from Her Honor Senator Thompson and Senator Reverend Canon Dr. Rogers. And indications of absence as well from Senator Lorenzo Hurd, and indications of lateness from the Most Honorable Senator Walcott. Minutes of our meeting of October 25th, 2023.
Mr. President, I beg to move that the minutes of our meeting held on Wednesday, October 25th be deferred at this time.
The question is that the minutes of our meeting held on October 25th, 2023 be deferred. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The things the ayes have it, those minutes are accordingly so deferred. Before we leave announcements, just an indication as well of the absence of Senator Crystal Drakes for today's sitting.
Presentation of petitions, presentation of papers, reports from select committees, questions to ministers, requests for leave to move the adjournment of the Senate on matters of urgent public importance, statements by ministers or parliamentary secretaries, personal explanations, motions relating to the business or sin of the Senate moved by minister, introduction of bills.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to give notice of the following resolution. Resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Cap 225, the vesting in the National Housing Corporation, NHC, of a parcel of land situated at Dawes Plantation in the parish of St. Philip, and more particularly described in the schedule for residential, commercial, and recreational purposes.
Public business, sir.
Public business is the order of the day.
Order number one.
Order number one.
In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225, the lease to the Autism Association of Barbados, a charity registered under the Charities Act, Chapter 243, as charity number 612, of a parcel of land, the property of the state, situate at the garrison in the parish of St. Michael in this island for its basic life skills program.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Before I begin my formal presentation, I hope that I can be given the opportunity to take the liberty of being leader of the Honorable the Senate to express the congratulations on the government side to His Honor the President on the receipt of the highest award of the Barbados Labour Party at our annual conference just last week. Our esteemed leader of our country, at one point he was, and a stellar leader he was, is recognized as a national hero of Barbados, and therefore the award of the Barbados Labour Party in the name of Grantley Adams to our Honorable President is by no means a small feat, and we would wish to congratulate him for his years of service to the country and to the Barbados Labour Party. Congratulations, Mr. President.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Leader of the Senate. It is a humbling moment, but also an honor for me to have my name associated with the man that described as the Moses of his generation, father of democracy, Grantley Herbert Adams, even if only by an award. That non-causal relationship, that spurious correlation, as you call it, is statistics. But his name abiding in the same sentence is really an honor for me. I really appreciate your words of congratulations this morning. Please continue.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And in that same vein, I would wish to congratulate all of those who had a hand in the planning of a very successful conference last weekend, not the least of whom is our own colleague sitting here in the Senate, Senator Patricia Parris, who serves as CEO of our very beloved party. So congratulations also to you, Senator Parris. So colleagues, I want to begin this resolution that is before us in the vesting of land by perhaps situating the conversation within the context of how important it is for Barbados to engage and to embrace the third sector in the country. Mr. President, many of us, we've been here before, we've had resolutions that we have passed before, the most recent of which, Mr. President, was a resolution for inclusive play under the Rotary Club of Barbados just a few months ago at the gym area of the gymnasium. And it is my hope, Mr. President, as a Rotarian myself, that that particular matter will be brought to a closure and a matter of conveyance can be completed urgently and as a matter of priority, because the purposes for which the third sector engages with us as a government, any government, Mr. President, is for the interest or in the interest of people in a particular demographic group. The resolution that is before us today, Mr. President, specifically focuses on those persons who are living and dealing with persons with autism, persons who are on the autistic spectrum, Mr. President. And that is critical. Why is it critical, Mr. President? Now, many of us historically grew up in a Barbados where we had that child in our class or that child in our school who came across as different. People didn't always understand that there was a spectrum. We didn't know what an autism spectrum was growing up. And recently, Mr. President, just last week, under the ministry that I have the privilege of leading, we hosted the inaugural Caribbean Energies Investment Summit here in Barbados. There were over 350 delegates that gathered in the energy sector here in Barbados to talk about the energy transition in the Caribbean. And we saw it fit as a ministry, Mr. President, to have in the margins of that conference a youth forum. We had students from our nation's secondary school being exposed to the issues in the energy industry. And I was very pleased to be there at the opening of that. But what caught my attention, aside from the amazing young people who were there, and I didn't even know that we have a program now in our CSEC program, I think it's CSEC, for green engineering. I thought that was brilliant. I never knew that that was one of the subjects that we now offer. But, Mr. President, what caught my attention on that day was a young man from one of our nation's secondary schools, clearly high functioning on the autism spectrum. He greeted me and he spoke with me. He was sitting with his peers, but in speaking to me and in greeting me, he was extremely enthusiastic. But you could tell he was high functioning on the autism spectrum. And I watched his peers and the other students around him dissolve into snickers as he spoke. I watched other children around him not understand what it meant to be a child who is on the spectrum. And he was in a regular school. Clearly, he was performing extraordinarily well because he was taking all of the science subjects and preparing for exams, but he was also definitively on the spectrum. And the reality, Mr. President, of so many young people, children, who are living with autism and being immersed in a mainstream environment means that we're dealing not only, Mr. President, with those persons who are themselves autistic, but their caregivers, their families, their teachers, and their peers, and ensuring that there is a learning education experience for them so that people stop snickering, so that people stop looking at them sideways, so that whether they're high functioning or otherwise, that they don't feel excluded from spaces that clearly they have every right to be in. That caught my attention last week, Mr. President. It caught my attention last week also because one of my best friends in the world, and I want to beg your indulgence to say her name publicly, she has a son with autism. Ade, son of Tracy Knight Lloyd, he is 17 years old. I remember when Ade was younger. I remember when Ade couldn't be touched. I remember when he was completely nonverbal. I remember when she was first dealing with an autism diagnosis. I remember hearing her speaking about how she dealt with sharing that news and that diagnosis with her family about her then 2-year-old son. He is now 17, Mr. President, and I have watched the investment that she as a mother has made in her son and how at 17 years old, Ade is verbal, he is sometimes more independent than children who are not even on the spectrum at all. He chooses his clothes every day. He does his own laundry. He does horseback riding. He does swimming. He has a very distinct sense of his own style because he wants to wear only certain things and he will choose what those things are, and you can't tell him anything different. Routine is important to Ade, but it is important because Tracy, his mom, has set the parameters for her child to live his best life on the autism spectrum. But what that has meant, Mr. President, is that it has been a significant investment. It has meant that for persons who are living with children with autism, they have to commit to physiotherapy if they're having mobility challenges in some instances. They have to deal with speech therapy if they're nonverbal. They have to find that space where their children thrive. In Ade's case, it was in the water and it was on horseback. And so the investment that it takes, Mr. President, for children who have different needs is sometimes onerous on parents. That, Mr. President, makes initiatives like this far more than the vesting of land to an autism association or even more, Mr. President, than a partnership between the National Housing Corporation. It is an investment in people who live and view life differently, not just those who are living with autism, but I want to take a moment to draw attention to the persons who care for persons who are living with autism. Not just even autism, Mr. President. We have a few weeks ago, or rather we had a few weeks ago, persons who were representing the Alzheimer's Association, persons who are living with Alzheimer's and dementia, persons who are living with children with different types of special needs, persons who are living with persons who are elderly, who need to provide care. We often forget that caregivers of all kinds perhaps are dealing with challenges and burdens that are as great as those perhaps who are themselves living with a disease or a special need or some kind of need for care. Sometimes people need a moment. Sometimes people need to be refreshed. Sometimes people need to be given a space just to say, I understand what you are going through. I understand how hard this is for you. It was not easy, Mr. President, to watch my friend go through the process of having to adjust to not having a child who was not on the autism spectrum at all, to having to deal with all of the things that were going to be required to make sure that her child is living his best life. It was not easy, Mr. President, and I'm sure that that is the case for every other parent that is out there, who, for a parent to have to rationalize, my child is not going to grow up, get older, get married, in most instances, leave my home, and they're going to be living on their own. They're always going to be, in some way, dependent on the provision of services to ensure that they're supported. That's a massive realization for a parent. And so we have to be able to think not only, Mr. President, of how we can make initiatives like this a reality, but how we can expedite them through the system. Mr. President, this is a matter that has been before us and has been in the pipeline since 2019. Perhaps we need to be able to expedite these things much faster because the people who they benefit need them, Mr. President. The people who they benefit are dealing with many of the issues that are confronting them every single day, and we have to be able to support them. Mr. President, what specifically is being asked in this instance is specifically for a parcel of land. That parcel of land is in the area around the garrison, and that land is being leased for a period of 10 years with an option to renew for an additional period of 10 years. It outlines what the rent will be. The rent is to be reviewed at 5-year intervals, Mr. President, and the leasee, in this instance, the Autism Association of Barbados, will be responsible for keeping the premises in good repair, inclusive of structural repairs, throughout the term of this lease. They also will take on the responsibility for developing the site, Mr. President, and ensuring that they're working with the Town and Country Planning Department and any other statutory entity who will take responsibility for supervising the regulatory management of this land. And then finally, Mr. President, they are also responsible for dealing with the associated taxes, including land taxes, property and insurances, and so on, arising from the property. So, Mr. President, this is what the resolution on paper tells us it sets out to do. But we have already established that we're dealing with something that is far greater than just a lease of land. We are providing services for persons who are living and dealing with autism. And that brings me to the second point that I want to make, Mr. President. Sometimes, across the country, we have a government that has spoken on many occasions about fiscal space. And what fiscal space means. The ability, Mr. President, to be able to have the wherewithal within your budget to make available financial resources to the various agencies that are needed to do different things. Simply put, Mr. President, just like in our households, just like in our bank accounts, just like in our checking accounts, Mr. President, there may simply not always be all the money that we want to be able to have access to do all the things that we want to be able to do. A government is no different. Most times, government is spending far more than it is taking in. And that makes it important, Mr. President, for the relationships with social service organizations and with the third sector to be prioritized. If we can't do it all ourselves, Mr. President, then we have to partner with those that do. And this is an opportunity on this occasion, Mr. President, for entities like the Autism Association of Barbados to have the benefit of support. Now, I want to put this into further context, Mr. President. Government owns the land. Government is leasing the land to an association that may not have the financial resources to do all of the things that you may want to do. And in so leasing the land, Mr. President, the Autism Association is able to go to the market. I can't tell you how many times, and I'm sure that there are others in here, who belong to different service organizations, who take the time, sometimes on weekends and at night, to be able to write letters of sponsorship to the business community. If you're a school, sometimes when you're trying to sponsor a small group, you may have a cake sale, a car wash, those kinds of things. We have put on shows coming up later on next month. Is going to be Carols by Candlelight, which is the flagship event in the Barbados Rotary Clubs and Rotary Club of Barbados. And those are the things that then provide financial resources that feed back into the community. But here's what I want to make as the extension of that point, Mr. President. I can speak about Rotary because I'm a Rotarian, and I'm sure that every other member who's a service club member can speak about their clubs. Service clubs, Mr. President, have access not only to the monies which they raise, but they have access, if they're part of an international organization, to being able then to have regional grants or international grants. If in the Rotary Club of Barbados, for example, we raise $100,000, we can get a matching grant of a further $100,000 from our regional, the regional fund or the Rotary International Fund, or sometimes $500,000. It allows government to use the relationship with the third sector and with service organizations to be able to close that gap in fiscal space where social service projects are concerned. Projects like this. There is an institution called the Schoolhouse for Special Needs, Mr. President. It is, again, a service club investment. They got the land, again, vested. They built the property, went for a mortgage and built the property, used fundraising on an annual basis to be able to pay off the mortgage. That mortgage is fully paid off. Now, what does the Schoolhouse for Special Needs do, Mr. President? It caters for children who would not be able to assimilate into the normal school environment. And they make a pathway not just for children who are at school age, but even beyond. And they have invested extensively in creating a cooperative environment specifically around the arts. The visual arts, paintings, craft, and so on, that these children then are able to use as a means of earning income, also for the school, but for themselves to be able to contribute to their independence. Projects like these are important for Barbados and important for our communities. Partnerships like these with associations like the Autism Association of Barbados, and I want to commend them and every other service organization, are important to our community. What it also brings me to, Mr. President, is my final point. My final point. One of the reasons why sometimes when we talk about the third sector, Barbadians are sometimes a little recalcitrant about how they're going to give their support to these various associations. More and more, I have to confess, I am growing concerned that if I'm giving to the Salvation Army, I'm giving to the Salvation Army. If I'm giving to the Red Cross, I know I'm giving to the Red Cross. If I'm giving to the Lions, the Optimist, Kiwanis, or whomever, I know I'm giving to them. But more and more, you are finding individuals with the odd sheet appearing outside of supermarkets and outside of stores, and you can't always verify their credentials and who you're actually giving to. And that there has to be, I think, a mechanism that allows us to be able to identify what causes we're genuinely donating to and who is an authentic representative of that cause. Because it is so pervasive now everywhere. Everyone is telling you, come and give money for this, but you can't always verify what you're giving money to. So I don't want there to be a scenario where, Mr. President, we don't support things that are genuine causes because we are uncertain as to whether or not they are authentic. And so it is important, Mr. President, that perhaps there needs to be a mechanism where all of these entities become registered, as there is a provision for it in the Corporate Affairs and Intellectual Property Registry Office, where they're registered charities, and that they have some kind of identification when they are out and they're having their fundraising events. So, Mr. President, I don't want to belabor this particular point, except to say that as a government, we support initiatives of this kind. As a government, we support persons coming forward and making a commitment to support the community, in particular the most vulnerable among us. And then finally, also as a government, Mr. President, as we continue to speak about issues relating to education and the education sector reform, also, we have heard about the importance of making sure that there's a provision of early childhood education. And as we talk about early childhood education now being a part of this process, equally, it means that the identification of children who have special needs at an early age, so intervention can take place, must also, and it is also, a part of this government's commitment to our nation's people. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this resolution do now pass.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Speakers? Senator Boyce, Andrew Boyce.
Mr. President, thank you for recognizing me. I stand this morning in total support of the resolution before the chamber, sir, ultimately because I think associations like the Autism Association of Barbados and the other organizations, those that fall under the umbrella of the Barbados Council for the Disabled and others, really do God's work. You know, growing up, as a person with a disability myself, my parents would often say that they pray to God that He will allow them to live long enough to see me become a man. And while I think that that is the prayer of every Barbadian parent, there's an angst, there's a fervence associated with that prayer when you are a parent of a child with a disability, and perhaps more pointedly, a parent of a child with autism in this instance, or special needs more broadly. And that prayer, sir, is because the prevailing circumstances heretofore have not inspired confidence in those parents, have not inspired confidence that their child will have the ability to have a quality of life, to independently make a living, and with the use of their talents, make space for themselves in this society. They're not confident, sir, that the Barbadian dream properly belongs to their child, not because of who their child is, but what this society has been historically. Sir, and it is in the context of those prevailing circumstances that organizations like the Autism Association of Barbados have stood in the gap and have raised their voices, even and especially when it appears that no one is listening. It is these organizations, sir, that provide succor and support to parents. It is these organizations that help parents and families more broadly to come to grips with the particulars of a diagnosis, oftentimes by which they are utterly mystified. And so I must give credit to these organizations for their continued advocacy. And in specific relation to the Autism Association, sir, with your permission, I would like to acknowledge the president of that association, Mr. Frederick Frank Johnson, for he and his members, for their continued advocacy and for raising their voices over and over again and agitating against the backdrop of those prevailing circumstances, sir. I talk about the prevailing circumstances, sir, but out of an appreciation also that we're in a moment of transformation, where a prime minister and her cabinet has determined that as a country we must do better, and that as a central part of the country's social policy agenda is the improvement of the lives of persons with disabilities. And over the last 16 months, I have had the pleasure of sitting on the National Advisory Committee for the Improvement of the Lives of Persons with Disabilities, a committee that has traveled the length and breadth of this country, consulting with stakeholders, members of the community, in the crafting of a national disability policy 2023 to 2030. And there will come a time, sir, when this chamber benefits from a more fulsome discussion on the contents of that strategy. But it must be said, sir, that the government recognizes that partnership is important. The government recognizes that as it attempts to improve the lives of persons with disabilities, it cannot do it alone, and that policy and pronouncement from places like these alone will not lead us where we need to go. But what is also necessary is partnerships with organizations and individuals of goodwill committed to the cause, sir. I mentioned the president of the Autism Association earlier and his members, and I have to perhaps again tip my hat to them, because in those very consultations that I referred to earlier, they were an active voice. They brought the perspectives of parents, of individuals with autism. They highlighted challenges, sir, in many cases, most movingly in ways that would bring you to tears, sir. And it is a central part of the work that the government is doing, I think, while it is creating a legislative and policy framework for the recognition and the protection of persons with disabilities, and in this instance, specifically persons with special needs. It is also ensuring that parents of children with special needs and persons with disabilities can sleep easier at night, and that they can worry less about who is going to take care of their child when they're no longer here, and worry less about what skills they can reasonably impart to them, and worry less about the world that they are leaving them to, sir. We are also having this conversation, sir, in the context of an extraordinary interconnectedness of policy. And by that I mean, there is the draft National Disability Policy 2023 to 2030, and there is this resolution, but there are also things like the National Sports Policy, sir, that make space for the sporting prowess of persons with disabilities and persons with special needs, because we cannot limit the ways in which persons with disabilities have the ability to share their talents with the world. I know my good friend and colleague, Senator Nichols, believes that every child who can should play cricket. But
you compare my games.
yes. Well, he believes, and he is right to the extent that whatever their capacities are, it is our job to create the space for them to be excellent at it. Yes, because it is not our job to foreclose on anybody's dream. It is not our job to foreclose, sir, on the ability to have perhaps a Sagari who is on the autism spectrum, or 3W, or one of the 3Ws, or someone with one of the talents of the 3Ws, I should say, who is on the autism spectrum. So that the existence of that policy, sir, is indicative of a country committed to doing better. And then there is the National Education Reimagination or Transformation process, where explicitly in policy we are recognizing, or we are formulating an education system that is prepared to take measure of the competencies and the genius of persons with disabilities and persons with special needs, and to provide the enabling environments and the accommodations necessary for their flourishing, sir. Because if we believe that the elitist and colonial education system has not served some as well as it could have, then perhaps consider the realities for those that it hasn't very much served at all. And then there is, sir, we heard parents in those very consultations talk about the need for the expansion of the category of persons who receive the disability benefit from the National Insurance Scheme, sir. Currently, those categories are quite limited, and there's a concern about who will look after my child when I am no longer here. And there is a desire by parents, and it has been, and we have heard both the Prime Minister and the Substantive Minister speak to it, the ability of parents to pay into a system for when they are no longer here in the names and in the interest of their children. So that this resolution that is principally about the provision of basic life skills, sir, is but one of the measures in a multiplicity of measures and policy to improve the lives of persons with disabilities. The resolution in its substance, sir, relates to basic life skills. And you may ask yourself, members of the public may ask themselves, what is this notion of basic life skills and why is it important? And as the name suggests, they're particularly basic things. These are the things that may help a child with autism or with special needs develop a personal hygiene routine, or help them to greet people with less angst. Senator Cummings referred to the way in which the young man greeted her earlier. Or the ability to, go to the shop and interface with persons with less angst. And I think we also have to appreciate that there's a connection between those very basic skills, or what we may take to be very basic skills, and the independence of these children, I say children, but the independence of these individuals, and perhaps more to the point, also things like the employment and the employability of these individuals. So that, sir, nothing is in a vacuum. There is a connectedness to all of the policy that the government is contemplating on this issue. I will take the opportunity, as I mentioned, employability, I will take the opportunity to appeal to the private sector and to appeal to perhaps all sectors of the society to employ persons with special needs and to employ, persons with disabilities, sir. Because, as I indicated earlier, there is a genius and an acumen and a prowess that exists in every individual. And what they require is the enabling environment, the accommodations. And it may look to you from where you sit in the business sector or anywhere else as extraordinary, as too heavy a lift, as too far a distance, sir. But such must be your commitment to the development of this country, that you ensure that these individuals, the most vulnerable of our society in many cases, have the space to look after themselves, to live independent lives to the extent that they can, also while contributing to your profitability and your income streams and all the rest of it. I think as Barbados contemplates improving the lives of persons with disabilities, as it contemplates a national strategy around persons with disabilities, sir, we have to admit that we are coming from a far distance behind. But this is a government that has committed to doing the work of improving the lives of persons with disabilities, and the ask is that all of Barbados join the government in that effort, and that Barbadians of goodwill, wherever they are, find it in their hearts to ensure that these persons have a chance at the Barbadian dream. Sir, this resolution, I think, is emblematic of the partnership that we need if we are going to improve the lives of persons with disabilities. This is evidence of a government committing to getting closer to the problem. Senator Dr. Hines looks at me knowingly because it is something she says in her quite often, that sometimes we need greater proximity to the issues and to the people. And there is no greater example of a government doing that, sir, than this. Let me also say that in the context of our commitment to improving the lives of persons with disabilities, that members of the community will tell you that the substantive minister and the substantive ministry have developed somewhat of an open door policy, and that they have greater access on the issues that trouble them, sir. And again, I say, such is the commitment of this government on this issue. Sir, building an inclusive society and economy for persons with special needs requires that commitment and that partnership to which I refer, and a culture of inclusion. And this government, and it is a process. We will not get there all at once. We will not get there in the blink of an eye or the twinkling of a nose, but it is a commitment for a better Barbados, and it is a commitment from which this government does not shirk, sir. And so I began by talking about praying parents. And so my prayer is that may this resolution bless the lives of persons with autism, and may it inure to their benefit. May it become a model of partnership, and may it inspire Barbadians of goodwill and big hearts to join the government in making this country better, safer, and more inclusive for every Barbadian.
Thank you very much, Senator Boyce. Senator Kevin Boyce.
Mr. President, I actually am just rising to commend the speech which was delivered. I have risen before, after one of Senator Anduele, we like to call him Boyce the Younger speeches, to gently chastise. And I felt very moved. I think he wove a tapestry that was impressive of personal, while linking public, private, and governmental policies, of course, being a government senator. And I wanted to record that It was a fantastic contribution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Senator Kevin Boyce, and so say all of us. Other speakers, I fear that Senator Andrelli may have stunned them into silence. Senator Bradford, Senator Dr. Bradford.
Mr. President, just briefly to say that I endorse the sentiments of Senator Boyce, and I congratulate Senator Andrelli Boyce for his presentation. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Bradford. Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too want to extend congratulations for that moving speech by Senator Boyce. But I also want to take the opportunity to really look at what has been happening in Barbados since 2018. You know, the motto, a better life for our people. One of the most attractive, I should say, set of words that I have heard since they can because they think they can. Those two things have made such an impact on my life. It is unbelievable. And with this resolution, you can see where that motto comes to life. You know, they say that the hallmark of any civilization is how it treats its most vulnerable persons. And this is a clear example of the society coming together to deal with the issue that for those of you who are old enough to understand what it was like to have in your village, in your communities, persons who were shut away because they were different. And it could have been from a physical standpoint, or it could have been from a mental standpoint. They were shut away. And I think when you see things like this beginning to happen, I know oftentimes we as Barbadians can knock each other as hard as possible when we do wrong. And we find it very difficult to congratulate ourselves when we make strides. These are the strides that we need to be able to celebrate. I mean, for those, like I said, for those of you who are old enough to know, you live in a small community, and sometimes all you will hear is that there's a son or a daughter inside a particular home. You never get to see them. Never get to see them. And like I said, those persons would be living, I guess, almost in oblivion, only to the immediate family. But those on the outside, they never get to interact. They never get to live to the fullest capacity of their lives. And here now, that we've reached this stage where we recognize that we can no longer operate as we did in the past, I believe that it is time for us to also look to see in what other areas can both government, the third sector, whoever, private persons, whoever, can join together to do things that will also enable, from the sporting community to the cultural community to other things that need that same type of assistance. And as government has a number of buildings that for many years have been left in, just to say, out of use, to be safe, that they can find other opportunities such as this to partner with other organizations. And I'd like to, again, stress reputable organizations, as was mentioned by Senator Cummings, to ensure that these things don't just end up being there and then they're going to wear and tear and then we have to find some time to knock them down and all this sort of stuff. But that we can use the terms that people talk, upcycle and recycle and all of these things, that we can really grasp it and do the things that we need to do so that we're not starting from scratch all the time in trying to get simple things done. This initiative for those persons on the autistic syndrome spectrum, as was mentioned earlier, this is really a monumental effort by the association themselves, and I really want to take the chance to say how pleased I am that government saw it fit to support this particular initiative. But like I said earlier, it is incumbent upon us now that the precedent has been set, that the other organizations out there who are seeking to do good work, as the Autism Association is doing, that you also, if you don't know how to get it done, use the opportunity to speak to those who set the bar high and find out how do you manage to do this with government. But I also want to send out a challenge to the business community, that when you see efforts like this being undertaken by organizations, government, and whoever, that you too have a role to play in making these dreams and aspirations realities. And I speak specifically when it comes to things like building. We have numbers, this is a small island, but we have a number of businesses that deal with things like cement, deal with things like wood, deal with hardwares and all of these things. And sometimes it would be, I guess, ideal that in some of these instances where the needs are clearly seen and are important, that we can get companies to invest in these things. Now, how would they do that? I will not be in a position to say what they should do or what they should not do. But I believe that at some point in time, even if it is donating stuff, you can donate some stuff, you can take less prices on some things, but get involved and do something, because at the end of the day, on 166 square miles, there are a lot of places where the general public is going to go to spend money. They spend money with you for years. In fact, I dare say sometimes centuries. And it is incumbent on all of us as Barbadians that when things like these arise, that you do whatever you can. I have been involved in many of these types of things over the years as an artist, lending my support to them. But I believe sometimes that those who benefit in a completely different way in this society also need to be able to say at some point in time, as a conscious, that, okay, it might not affect me, I may not have a child with these differences or whatever, but whatever I can do that can help to speed up the process or to make it a lot easier that we can get these things done, I believe it is incumbent on them to do so. And because I know how wonderful my people are, I would take the opportunity now to thank all those persons who just listened to me and who are going to contribute now. As I know that they will, as good Barbadians, I want to thank you now, while I'm here, for the contribution that you are going to make towards making sure that this building is restored and handed over to the Autism Association to do the work which is very much needed at this particular time for those persons. And with those few words, I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President, for acknowledging me. I really felt compelled to speak to this resolution. Mr. President, I've spent perhaps most of my formative years involved in the nonprofit sector. working with organizations at the community level. I would have worked with the Barbados Youth Council at one time, would have been president of the Barbados Youth Development Council. So I know of Barbados when there were community groups and community organizations right across the country, from Deacons to Pinelands to wherever. There were community and service organizations working to address social concerns that perhaps as a society we might not have seen them on a grand scale, but it was because of these organizations coming into spaces where government was perhaps, again, not already paying attention to and elevating the cause, elevating the concern. But not only that, not only then looking to government to fix it after they've brought the concern, but themselves being active change agents in order to be able to address the concerns. Mr. President, even as we congratulate the Autism Association for this work and other organizations like it, I want to note that many of the persons who make up these organizations do so at a great amount of personal sacrifice. They don't get paid, or in many instances are severely underpaid. They use their own resources, both money and time, and leverage other resources in order to fix big social development issues that are not only of a concern to themselves, but of a concern nationally. So that we have a class of volunteers in this country that are not recognized, Mr. President, for that contribution. And not only are they not recognized in terms of remuneration, but also the respect that we give to them. Having worked within the nonprofit sector for quite some time, I know personally the level of disrespect you get from society and others that you have to engage with. Because the assumption is that as some person working in the nonprofit sector, either you can't find a job somewhere else, either you just want to find time to do something, you're not a professional. And so there's also a level of disrespect and a level of which the society does not see, notice, and value the contribution. And I think, Mr. President, that is something that we have to be able to recognize and laud, again, not only for the Autism Association, but also all of the other persons and all of the other organizations that are doing this fundamental work. There is within the literature the suggestion that in relation to the third sector, the advantage or the competitive advantage the third sector has is about its ability to function in ways that are more flexible in order to be able to address concerns, its ability to leverage consensual decision-making, whereas the state is seen as coercive. The nonprofit sector leverages relationships, builds consensus in order to be able to deliver, in order to be able to address the concern. And then as well, Mr. President, they're able to function in ways that sometimes the state is not best placed to do. One of the organizations that I would have worked with is an organization that assists women who are on the street. And that is not a space, Mr. President, that the state can enter very easily. But this is an organization where volunteers are working when we are sleeping because they are also outside on the street, delivering services, providing counseling, and providing resources for that particular constituency, also underseen and underserved, Mr. President. But again, very little recognition for their contribution. Again, these volunteers, Mr. President, and I know that this is particularly, I would say I'm going to get a little bit passionate about this now because it's very personal. I know people who have worked within this sector for years, sometimes 30 years, have been their life and will leave the organization with no social security, no insurance, no compensation, because very often the organizations are not in a position to be able to provide, Mr. President, for that. And so that the burden that these organizations shoulder in terms of providing that service, taking up that development space ensuring that we have the level of inclusive society that is needed, Mr. President, is something that we cannot underestimate. I also, Mr. President, want to pick up on a point that was raised by Senator King in relation to that notion of giving. We live in a society, and it has become even more so, when, again, that era when we had volunteerism and people were given, they would give their time, they would give their resources. We certainly, Mr. President, have seen that we've moved away from that. For many of us, our own little space and our own family are what drives us. And we see that as well in terms of the private sector. We now have this notion of corporate social responsibility, where the private sector sees they're given and is supposed to, in theory, provide budgets in order to support charitable and given to development organizations. But very often, and when I was at the Caribbean Policy Development Center, we had done a study looking at corporate social responsibility in Barbados specifically. And what we realized was that we were not having necessarily corporate social responsibility, but that people, and the private sector in particular, were given to areas in which they saw specific economic benefits. So they were given to sporting teams because they could go and put up a tent and have their logo, Mr. President. They were given in areas where they could have T-shirts, and the T-shirts could have the logo. But very often the big, fundamental, and deep development work was not being resourced under this notion of corporate social responsibility because it could not necessarily be seen. There was no advertising to be done because if you are serving these populations, intrinsically, you should not then want them to put them out on a pedestal like that. And therefore, we have a dynamic that we also need to be able to contend with. That even as these organizations, as I said before, take up this big mandate, this big development space, support an inclusive society, that they also function heavily under-resourced. And even, Mr. President, when there are resources, then they are also asked to operate in ways that question their transparency and accountability. And while I agree fundamentally that those are important things, the nonprofit sector has to be accountable, it has to be transparent, but so do we all. So do we all. But there is often a different metric that is applied to the nonprofit sector about how they use funds and how they use public resources that we sometimes don't see, Mr. President. I will say that very frontally, in other areas. And sometimes even when we do have the systems and processes in place, we are still asked, Mr. President, to go even double more and more beyond, Mr. President, than this. And so this notion of working with the third sector is something that we have to be able to unpack. And I want us to, yes, feel good about the work that the Autism Association is doing, the role that it's playing with this particular constituency, but also to recognize that there is a larger context about how organizations like the Autism Association have to function within our particular context, and the enabling environment that needs to be further created to give them recognition, to give them the space that they need in order to have the resources to do the work that they need to in the big way that they need to, Mr. President. The final issue that I would speak to in this context as well is also about the voice and the representation for the constituencies that are to be represented again. It is very interesting that in the context of this debate, when we have this discussion about the Autism Association, the leasing of land, that we began then, Mr. President, to hear more commentary on the plight of this particular constituency, what is happening with them, the statistics and everything around autism. So that the ventilation of the issue brought attention. But what happens, Mr. President, What happens, Mr. President, if we were not having this discussion? And as Senator Boyce would have indicated, we do have this government making significant strides in terms of its work and giving voice to the differently able sector. But very often, we pay attention to only what we consider those big macro issues. We pay attention, Mr. President, as we are now, to the roads that are flooded. We pay attention to the economic and macro metrics, what is happening within the economy. But very often, we then don't see, or we don't take stock of also what is happening within the social development sector, and particularly, as I said, Mr. President, for those voices that are not able to speak as loud, that don't have the leverage, that don't have the resources to be able to amplify the voices. And it is important that within that context, Mr. President, that we are very careful in the consideration of how we work as a society, as government, as the private sector, work with these organizations to be able to be sensitive to these circumstances, to be able to acknowledge, one, the value of the contribution. In fact, one of the things that I was sorry that I was not able to complete when I was at the Caribbean Policy Development Center was the development of a methodology that would actually allow us to count for the economic contribution that these organizations make to the society, because they do make an economic contribution. What if the government had to provide for the services that these organizations are providing for? There is a cost, Mr. President, that these organizations are providing, again, with little resources. What if the government had to step in and provide them? That is a cost. In many instances, they provide sometimes employment, Mr. President. They employ people. At the Caribbean Policy Development Center, we organize regional conferences, sometimes as much as 10 and 12 in a year, bringing people together, Mr. President. That's cost. We employ people. We're paying for tickets. We're paying for services. All of these things are contributions that the nonprofit sector make, but again, is not necessarily accounted for, Mr. President. And I think that these things have to be taken into context. I do know that the ministry with responsibility for the third sector has under its consideration NGO legislation. And that legislation then is intended to provide, again, the specific recognition to the NGO sector, and also as well to provide it with the level of incentives, hopefully, and provide it as well, Mr. President, with the character that will allow the community, the society, to have some assurance in relation to its accountability and its relation to its transparency as well. And I believe if I can speak and still speak on the behalf of the nonprofit sector, that is not something that is in contention. Organizations like the Autism Association, we would note that they have produced and continue to produce their annual reports, giving account for their activities, giving account for the funds that they receive, so that there is a commitment to be transparent. One of the other initiatives, and I know again that most organizations, because when I left the sector, a number of organizations in Barbados had actually signed on to a voluntary code of conduct in which they're committed to certain things to ensure that they operate at the highest level and at the highest standard. Mr. President, with those few words, I commend again the work of the Autism Association, but also as well bring attention to the circumstances under which organizations like the Autism Association have to function and work. I'm obliged, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Monroe. Senator Maladon.
Mr. President, thank you for recognizing me, and I'll just make a couple of brief comments. I will also congratulate the government on this initiative. It has my full and complete support. But I would just like to respond very briefly to a couple of comments which were made with regards to the private sector and others stepping up in this case. And I'd like to congratulate the significant effort that not only the Barbados private sector, but people who, as our Prime Minister has often said, You can be a Barbadian by birth, you can be a Barbadian by descent, but we have a lot of Barbadians by choice who come and spend significant time here on the island and give millions and millions each year. And it would probably be wrong of me because I will miss many, but the ones that came to my mind as I was thinking in quick reaction is charities like the Maria Holda Trust that gives every year to substantially support charities. Individuals like Derek Smith through the Sandy Lane Charitable Trust, and smaller local grown charities like the Because of Jenna Trust, which was close to my heart because I knew the young lady who it was named of. So it would be remiss of us and remiss of this chamber, and I beg your indulgence, Mr. President, in recognizing the significant work that the private sector, private individuals, and many individuals who are not Barbadians by birth or Barbadians by descent, but choose to live amongst our community and help us all. With those few words, thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Baldo. We thank and congratulate those persons named and those unnamed. Her Honour, Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I really want to say how much I have enjoyed this debate because of the various perspectives and the nuances given to the interventions made during the course of the morning. I want to, like others before me, particularly to commend Senator Ndwele Boyce, whom I think made the best speech ever, his best speech ever today. And it is clear that he not only spoke with a great deal of passion, but with an intimate understanding of the challenges of those who live with disabilities and humanized it for us. You know, so often that is what is missing, and the difference between the extent to which we are challenged to engage, to do something, to make a difference. It is that degree of empathy and understanding and seeing a face. A person with a disability, unless you know them, is just the person who is limping or needs help or that you may have to hold the door for, but you don't really appreciate how much more difficult it is for them to get up and face every day, and for the parents and the immediate support system to have to carry those individuals without the kind of extensive social services, financial support offered in larger countries where there are far more resources to help those who really need. And I think that I want to not just commend all of the families and the organizations so willingly giving support to people with disabilities, but to commend people with disabilities themselves for not giving up, for trying to live with dignity every day, for trying to ensure that they realize their maximum potential as individuals. And I therefore welcome amongst us, and particularly given his comments today, Senator Boyce, Ndwele Boyce, for whom I know just coming up the steps presents for him an even greater difficulty, something that we don't ordinarily think about. And indeed, I wouldn't really have given a second thought to had I not developed arthritis in my right knee and struggle now to deal with the steps. And we don't recognize really how what we take for granted and the most simple of tasks really represents a feat of great accomplishment for people with disabilities and for those who support them. So I salute all of those who have the sense of caring and empathy and the courage to keep going every day. I wish in that context really just to make two comments that I think also nuance the interventions in a different kind of way. And it is to say that government really, particularly in the setting of small island developing states, where there is so much competing There are so many competing interests for resources. Governments do not easily have the resources to carry all of the persons with disabilities. I believe that the last census and other estimates put us in the region of 10 to 15,000 people or thereabout, which is not a small sum in a small society of 270,000 people.
Now you have the new commercial plates, Mr. President, and I'm actually seeing them roll out more and more, seeing more vehicles with their like white license plate with the like blue writing. I like to see the commercial plates. It is a new innovation, and we're seeing that being rolled out, Mr. President. But equally so, the inclusion of private enterprise, private garages to take some of the pressure off of a single location in the Pine is also a part of the process. Perhaps, and I'm hopeful that the process of weighing vehicles hopefully will be removed at some point in time, and we will find another way to be able to reconcile the difference between what came in at the port by way of a vehicle that has been registered, the VIN number, the weight, and so on, and then what is actually placed on the road, that at some point there will be an innovation around what other countries and other markets have done with this identical scenario, the mischief that they're trying to correct, that this can be removed over time. But in the interim, until such time, Mr. President, what they have done is to take some of the pressure off of the single location that is the Pine in St. Michael by allowing for privately owned garages to be able to deliver these services. Now, this is an opportunity as well, Mr. President, for the inclusion of the private sector in the delivery of government services, because I also remember on that same occasion where I went to get my sticker, I kept saying, but why can't this be included when I go to get my insurance certificate? Why would the insurance company not equally be providing me at the time in 2019 with my new registration, my insurance certificate, and my sticker at the same time to show the period for which I am insured? So there is an opportunity equally so, Mr. President, for government in the same way that earlier we spoke about the third sector, the nonprofit sector, delivering community services, for the private sector, like the one we are discussing here today, Mr. President. I don't want to make too much of this specific, these two amendments, Mr. President, that will take me too broadly into a much bigger discussion. So I want to keep the discussion deliberately narrow on the amendments that are before us. One, Mr. President, the validation bill captured in order number 3, and 2, Mr. President, the amendments captured in order number 2, specifically on the appointment of duties of examiners and inspectors in respect to motor vehicles, and the change in the ages that we have captured in Section 76 of the Road Traffic Amendment legislation. And so with these very few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummings. Senator Malaloy.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just very briefly, sir. First of all, I'll start again with commending the government for this. This is a good piece of legislation, cleaning up something that needed to be dealt with for some time. I will express one bit of concern, Mr. President, in that we need to have very diligent and careful monitoring of the collection of revenue from the private garages so licensed. And there's nothing that speaks to that. And we do have a bit of a history of not being able to do this in an efficient way. So I express that concern, but overall, it makes a lot of sense. The changes in the ages makes a lot of sense and gets my full support. The commercial plates, I would also like to mention that very briefly. Again, a very positive move in the right direction that solved a lot of angst that was coming as a result of I don't know what to call it, an administrative implementation of something that was unintended. So that as well is excellent. But I would like to say, Mr. President, that more could have been done. And I'm disappointed that some of the other issues that we have spoken about in here with regards to the licensing authority were not addressed. I will specifically speak to the weight certificate, which continues. And why we didn't resolve that, I do not know. but I hope it will come forward. And finally, in closing, Mr. President, I would be remiss in not congratulating the transformation that is actually happening at the licensing authority. I am hearing from reliable sources who often work with the licensing authority that there are winds of change, that there is a new desire maybe to get things done. And perhaps there's a new sheriff in town. That part I can't speak to, but I've heard so as well. But I want to say that from what I can hear from those who are on the ground, the garages, people who deal regularly with the licensing office, things are changing, and they're changing in a positive direction, and I think that that is a good sign. So with those few words, I will support this bill, Mr. President. Thank you. I'm obliged to.
Thank you very much, Senator Maladu. Senator Dr. Rafford. Please change your mind.
Thank you, Mr. President, for recognizing me. I would like to also support this piece of legislation which brings efficiency and creates an opportunity for us to improve things that we have done in a traditional way over the years. I think that clearly the experiences which we have had of waiting in long lines is not a credit to our country, and it's not a credit to a modern society that has the advantage of a well-educated populace and spends millions of dollars every year educating people. If you spend millions of dollars every year educating people and your systems of governance are archaic, then clearly, in my view, you're spinning top in mud. And so it is good to see an entity that is being modernized, an entity that seeks to provide a better service for the population, an entity that over the years have had a significant amount of negatives associated with its operations. I am pleased to see the changes that are being made for the provision of licenses and driver's licenses, and the fact that those of a certain age will now have a longer period to drive. It recognizes that those in the evening of their days can still be active and can still make a contribution to the development of our country. I am sure that our country recognizes the contribution that senior citizens make to our society, both as sources of wisdom and experience, and also as mentors, guardians of the values of the society. And therefore, any approach that helps to facilitate the lives of senior citizens, I think is welcome. I hope that this will be the beginning of more comprehensive policy with respect to senior citizens, and I believe that respect for senior citizens is something we must promote as part of our culture and as a way of ensuring that the youth of our nation are aware of the builders of Barbados. I believe that a comprehensive policy going forward for the age should include additional privileges, especially for those over 85 years old. I was very intrigued by the fact that there was recognition that at 85, you should still be allowed to drive. and should have the right to have a license. I was thinking about it, and I said to myself, you know, in the development of that policy for the age, maybe we may come to a place at a time when we may even decide that people over 85 years old should not pay any taxes any longer. After all, if you live long enough to be 85, let's assume that you have started to work at 15. You would have been paying taxes for 70 years. That's a long time to pay taxes. By the time you reach 85, you should have the privilege and the honor of not paying taxes any longer. If you start at 25, of course, you would have been paying taxes for 60 years. That's a lot of time. And therefore, I think maybe in the development of the new policy for the age, for those who are in the senior stage of their lives, there should be these little privileges that could be considered. Over 85, no more taxes. So that you allow the older people to have some income that they can buy a gift for their grandchildren, or their great-grandchildren, as the case may be, or even help to pay for their education. And this, of course, would contribute to the youth of the nation also, if the old people had a little bit more money in their pocket to spend on such interesting things such as education and buy a gift for the children and the grandchildren. I'm sure that there are many other ideas that will be presented in this chamber and elsewhere for developing a policy for the age. I'm sure there are many who will be able to contribute to this policy when the time comes. But Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, it must be important that we embrace our senior citizens and give them the opportunity to remain active, productive citizens of our country. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Babbitt. Senator Paris.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to lend my support to this amendment before this honorable chamber. I see it as a simple one, which will improve the efficiency at the Barbados Licensing Authority. We have all heard of the horror stories of persons having to leave home early in the morning at the crack of dawn to go to the licensing authority to avoid the long wait times. With this amendment, we will have approved workshops and garages across Barbados that will be issuing these roadworthy certificates for private vehicles, and it is a step in the right direction. If someone is living in the north of the country, they will not have to traverse to the licensing authority in the Pine to have the roadworthy certificate if there is a garage or a workshop in their area. So that is something that Barbadians road users would look forward to. The workshops will have a high standard, and they are being inspected by transport officers at the Barbados Licensing Authority. You must have an enclosed area, proper record keeping, adequate staffing. The business must be registered with KIPO, and taxes must be up to date. And I see this as commendable. With adequate staffing at these approved garages, it, like I said, would eliminate long lines, and it will make it easier for persons doing business. I am expecting, however, that when these private garages and workshops are given the opportunity to issue the roadworthy certificates, that the examination results, we presently have to wait long to get the results, that this will be drastically reduced. So I look forward to that, and like other road users. Another thing that I'm looking forward to from the Barbados Licensing Authority is an efficient call center. There are persons who want to get information from the Barbados Licensing Authority. They call, no one answers the phone, so sometimes they leave home and they drive to the BLA to conduct business. When they get there, they don't have the proper documentation. So they have to drive back home, and if they live in St. Peter or St. Lucie, it is a far way to go. So if they had that call center available to them, with someone answering the phone, not a machine, then that will assist. We often say, but we put things on social media, we put them over the radio, but we have to think of the little old lady and the old gentleman who do not have access to social media and meet them halfway. They are accustomed to picking up the phone, because they still have the phone and the phone book, and calling a landline to hear an answer to give them direction. So I am looking forward to that call center. Mr. President, I think it is necessary too that attention be paid to the signage that we have across Barbados. If you drive around in the country, you see signs, and in the city too as well. You see broken signs, you see them on the ground, rusty signs. The areas the spelling is incorrect. And we in Barbados yes, we are Barbadians, and we might use the greenhouse or whatever, but there's some of us who still not use signs to follow the directions to get to the appropriate areas. Citizens and tourists use these roads and depend on the signage. They depend on guidance from the signage, and they find great difficulty in reading them. And sometimes you could find yourself miles away from where you are going. Not all road users use the GPS, so they depend on the sign. So I think an effort should be made to repair this signage across Barbados. Not only is it unsightly, but it gives you don't have guidance as to where to go. Tourism is still our main money earner, and as we move to a modern Barbados, the directional signage we see on our roads is inadequate. I spoke to this matter of signage in a previous debate, and I hope that on speaking to it a second time, that it is rectified. Mr. President, I would now like to speak to pedestrian crossings that currently exist on our roads. Pedestrians are legitimate road users and have a legal right to cross our roads safely and efficiently. Pedestrians often feel that once they use the marked crossings when crossing the streets, they are in a safe zone. And we therefore must protect them from oncoming traffic. In reality, some of these crossings are often fraught with danger. Indeed, many of these crossings are highly dangerous to pedestrians because of inadequate traffic control devices, inadequate lighting, or other visibility measures. Mr. President, I must also highlight the inconsiderate speeding by motorists when they are approaching these pedestrian crossings. I do not have the data to say how many accidents occur near to pedestrian crossings, but I will hazard a guess that there are quite a few. I am of the view that the time has come for us to critically examine each and every crossing across Barbados, especially given the increasing number of vehicles we now have on our roads, and the fact that a lot of our drivers are not paying attention or care too much about road users. Mr. President, I feel that before a crossing is decided on, that inspections be done at various times to assess the traffic flow, and so that we can cater to persons. I am appealing, if it is not done now, will it assess the area before putting down the pedestrian crossings, that it is done, it is implemented. This would provide valuable data as to the volume and characteristics of the pedestrian population who typically use the crossing. We have children because these crossings are near to schools, they're near to churches, we have elderly people using them, going to church. At times we have persons with disabilities using them. So we need to take all of this into consideration before we put the pedestrian crossing there. The general placement of the crossings should also be expertly considered. Additional safety features should be added close to the crossings to enhance safety. For example, we can put some speed humps, we need to speed bumps, we need to have traffic control devices. We have some, but not enough, to adjust the slow move to cater for slow-moving pedestrians. Mr. President, there should always be signage to indicate that you are approaching a crossing. Perhaps the presence of flashing lights and high-intensity activated crossing beacons would assist in this area and assist persons with the smooth flow of the traffic would be assisted with the smooth flow, and the persons will get from one end of the crossing to the other end safely. I know that there are some wardens at school crossings, but even when they are present, it creates a problem sometimes for children, especially when children are let down from PSVs. These large buses create visibility issues for pedestrians and motorists. This makes crossings dangerous. Mr. President, I highlighted the matter of pedestrian crossings because I see the danger. I see it every morning as I pass the area opposite the church. There's one by the St. Matthew's Church, and persons coming off that hill from Jackman's, they are traveling at a very high speed. So I speak of what I see happening daily, and I do believe that they should give some consideration to improving the placement of these crossings and making sure that they are safe for persons who use them. Mr. President, with those few words in closing, I once again pledge my support to the bill before this honorable chamber. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Paris. Senator Jonkin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I too want to rise to lend my support to these amendments. You know, sometimes we see things in a vacuum. And I want to begin by getting people to look at this, especially the amendments that are made towards, as was mentioned by Senator Brathwaite, the elderly, in terms of their being able to renew their licenses and to have the privilege of being able to do things for themselves. We came up in an era, and I always go back to those of us who are old enough to remember, when a lot of people, when they reach a certain age, they felt as if it's time to hang up my boots. I am 65. I retired from work. I no longer can drive. I no longer have a lot of things to do. I probably just look after the grands and chill out and wait, as they used to say back in the day, wait till the Lord come for me. These were things that you would hear growing up. Today's world, you hear some of the people like in my age group, as the Lord saying, but today's 60-year-old is like a 35-year-old. Or today's 75-year-old is like, not in terms of the structure of the body, but in the terms of their enthusiasm for life and for living and for being actively engaged in this thing that we call life. Now they can got the aches and pains. We all know that. I got mine. I have mine. We all have those. But this does not stop you from, as a lot of people did in the past, attending different things where your peers are out there, going to various events and enjoying life and this sort of thing. But whilst we are doing this, there's something that has always been concerning to me, and I probably sometimes wonder if I'm a part of the last of a dying breed of people in Barbados. People who respect age. Oftentimes when we are young, and I guess all of us would have gone through it, you never feel that you're going to get old. You take a lot of things for granted, and you enjoy life, as you say, to the max and whatever. But as was mentioned unofficially just now, when you begin to age, your reflexes and all of these things are not the same as when you were young. So imagine now that with all good intentions, we do this. And we have persons driving on the highways with much younger persons who are either impatient or downright unmanly to start off with, which is a problem that we have, which we don't want to deal with. We need to put some measures in place, may it be through GIS or whatever it is, whatever means it is. Because sometimes you can't depend on some parents to do it. But I say this, you need to put messages, whatever it is you need, to get some of our younger people to understand that they need to have a certain level of respect. And I'll use the word tolerance also for older persons, be it driving or walking. It really disturbs me to listen sometimes to some younger persons speaking when it comes to their interaction with older persons. And I don't know if this is coming from, I shouldn't say I don't know, I do know, let me not fool myself, I do know where it's coming from. With more access to other values and other beliefs from other parts of the world, more so than what we had when we were younger. People are heavily influenced by a lot of the things that they see. And I find that in my interactions with people, going across the length and breadth of this country, a lot of our older people, not necessarily abused in the sense of abuse, of physical abuse and these kind of things, but the kind of reaction sometimes you see people make, people going to church or trying to get down some steps or whatever, you see the look on some people's faces. It is simply like saying, oh, we don't get road so we can get where we need to get to. You can see it. Or even when they're driving, you know, you're on the highway, or say sometimes things in traffic, and you can see the impatience of the persons coming behind you farthest more, if you happen to be behind somebody else. So you might be driving behind the older person and taking the time going at the highway. But the person behind you now, in such a hurry to get to wherever it is that God knows where, at what time. You can't wait. You can hear the honking the horns all the time. Or, if you're unfortunate enough to hear the curse words coming out the mouth, you get to hear that too. So that when you do this with all good intentions, I am clear in my mind that we are going to have a fight on our hands to deal with that type of, I always refer to them as antisocial people, because that's what they are. You're going to have to deal with them also where this is concerned. All of us in this room, we are not as young as we used to be. And some of us, if we are fortunate enough, we will live to see the good ripe old age of 75, and where we could go back in and ask to get our license renewed too, if we are fortunate. And so it is incumbent upon us when we do things like this, in all seriousness, that we really look at some of the other implications and ramifications that it can have for the very people that we are seeking to help. And so, Mr. President, I won't belabor on this. Also, the ease of doing business has been a term that has been bantered about in Barbados since Adam was a lad. And this also, the mere fact that we could now expand getting those roadworthy certificates outside of just going to the licensing authority is a wonderful thing. And I think Senator Parris made the point. Imagine, in fact, you guys don't have to imagine, I believe all of you have had the experience of going into the Pine at 7:30, 8:30 in the morning, and come 5 o'clock, still ain't get through with what it is you were going to do. And I believe that if we do this, apart from looking at the things that were mentioned in terms of if they're VAT-registered businesses and the other things, we should also take into consideration locations, so that when it is done, the east, the north, the south, and the west can be serviced properly. And it still doesn't end up in a way where you've still got to come into town or go on the south coast from St. Peter or St. Philip or St. John or St. Lucie to get it done. And I think if you can strategically plan at least where some of these places will go, it would do very well for the people of Barbados. And so, Mr. President, with those few words, I'm obliged to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator King. Senator Maynard.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to continue on the line of the matter of pedestrian crossings. I happen to work at the QVH, and there's a clinic, an ENT clinic, sir, on the opposite side of the road in Enmore. And I recall, sir, when the hospital requested that a pedestrian crossing be put, an official crossing be put on that side, it took a considerable time. Now, there are a lot of elderly people, sir, who don't hear very well, who come to that clinic. And they're entirely dependent on the motorists who are approaching, stopping, because there are no lights, not even a simple flashing light to warn a motorist that someone is crossing. But the activity in that clinic doesn't necessarily stop sometimes, unfortunately, when it gets dark, because sometimes the clinic runs late. So in the darkness, you have people crossing the road. And I think that's an easy matter to fix, but that's been going on, sir, for at least 6 to 7 years. Sir, hopefully my minister will get it fixed. Sir, I took a little time to look at this bill, sir. And I want to make a specific comment about the amendment, sir, that speaks to Section 4. It may be a matter, sir, of language, but I think it causes, for me, a problem. And that, sir, that last section, Section 4, 5B, in the final paragraph states that where that person submits a medical certificate to the licensing authority signed by a medical practitioner as to that person's physical fitness, sir, one's physical fitness has nothing to do with mental fitness. And Senator Thompson pointed out, I think it was Senator Thompson this morning, that the census shows that there were significant numbers of people in this country affected by dementia. I believe, sir, that part of this bill, sir, needs to be clarified. Most doctors, sir, are responsible, and I don't believe they'll give a patient whom they know has dementia a medical certificate to drive, sir. Sir, because people with dementia don't always manifest all the symptoms all day. So you can be fooled, sir. But I believe, sir, that there should be an inclusion that is not only physical fitness. In fact, I happened, sir, this morning to speak to one of my prominent colleagues who's a psychiatrist. And the colleague sent me the form that they use for these assessments. And it does include, among all the other physical things like hearing loss and visual problems and seizures, a line, sir, for mental illness. And in that, I believe they include dementia. Sir, so I think that there needs to be consideration given to amending that section. Now, sir, this country has set a target, I believe, of 2030. I don't remember the exact term, but I suspect it says we're supposed to be, is it carbon neutral? 2030. I don't know if we can make it, but I hope we can. But there's been a lot of talk, sir, about the age of a car that should be allowed into the country. And I want to remind the Honorable Chamber that it takes 15 years of normal use from the date of manufacture for a car to eliminate its green footprint. So the notion that a car that is 4 years old is too old to be imported, sir, is a joke. If you are really talking about being green, it takes 15 years for a normal car driving 12,000 miles a year to eliminate its green footprint. So I'm not saying that the entire matter of going green is flawed, but certainly to restrict the importation of cars just because of age, sir, is not necessarily a good thing. And we haven't yet, sir, come up with a disposal plan for all these cars that we will have. Sir, I want to make one other point relating to the General Act, and it relates to trade plates. The trade plates that you can get at the garages use, with limited trade plates, and the ones you can hire from the Ministry of Transport. Sir, on occasion, I have noticed that at night, I've noticed some of these plates on the road. But really, they're supposed to be used between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. on any day. That includes Christmas Day. So you can use them any day. They're not restricted to you can't use them on weekends. Certainly the ones that come from the garages. The ones from the Ministry of Transport might be only used, I think, for the days that, Monday to Friday. But the time is 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And it has implications for insurance coverage, for when you use them and things like that, sir. Last, sir, I want to mention something that has bothered me a little bit. Some time ago, there was an article in newspaper. It might have been written, sir, by a former commissioner of police, speaking about the effect that road closures have on communities when the roads are used for rallying. And I have often wondered, sir, why is it that you have such activities, and I support rallying, I don't have a problem with it at all. But why is it, sir, that we will have a rally in the countryside, but we never close the middle-class developments to the rally and rally on their roads? We seem to always find the villages and shut them off. And I don't have a problem, sir, with having a rally going through. I don't have a problem with the roads and rolling hills being closed and have a rally going through there for 6 hours as a special stage. But nobody does it. And you would think that in this whole matter, it's supposed to be equitable treatment. And I don't think that in these times, sir, that any club, through whatever vested authority they may be given, should still be allowed to decide, we want to shut off you from your movements, and it's approved. I think it's something that needs to be stopped. That's just my view, sir. And I'm sure the people in the villages who get blocked off will support me in that. Now, Mr. President, as far as I know, this country doesn't have any legislation that governs emissions from cars. And maybe the time has, I know that we're supposed to go green, and we believe somehow that the internal combustion engine, whether it uses gasoline, diesel, or hydrogen, will die, and all the vehicles will be electric. I do not believe it, sir. I believe that too much money and time has been invested in the internal combustion engine. And the developments that is happening and the research will mean, sir, that it will continue. And whether they use hydrogen or not is left to be seen. But certainly synthetic fuels are a big thing. And some of the major, more expensive automotive manufacturers have invested large sums of money in developing synthetic fuels. We don't have a lot of those cars around, but people's pockets will be able to afford the fuels, because I'm sure they will cost more. But I think, Mr. President, that given all the levels of respiratory illness in this country, that maybe, sir, we need to one day have in this chamber legislation, sir, that deals with automotive emissions. I thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Senator Miller. Senator Dr. Hanks.
Thank you for acknowledging me, Mr. President. I really was not intending to speak on this amendment, but after listening to others and continuing to go through the amendment, I thought that I should at least make a few very brief points. I don't know if I can be as brief as Senator Malalou, but I will be brief. And I do think that to echo the sentiments already expressed, that these amendments that address age are quite useful. I don't necessarily agree with Senator King that this will add a lot that is new, because my understanding from some persons is that they're able to get that note from the doctor pretty easily to continue driving. So we already have older citizens driving on our roads. And yeah, it's 2 years or one, but the point is they're already on the roads. So it's not the length of time, but we still have persons on the road within this age category. It makes life easier for them, and I think this is something that is quite useful. I don't know if 60 is the new some other age, but I do know that there are a lot of people who can drive extremely well, who are older people. My father is one. I don't know if he wants his name called in here, and he would be too pleased to know that he does not have to get this doctor's note annually. But outside of this, I sat and I continued to think about the amendment to Section 3. And this is a good amendment. This is the amendment that allows for public officers and privately owned garages, as well as individuals, to do these inspections. This is a good thing, and I do not need to repeat the points that have already been made about not having to go to the licensing authority, stand up in lines, wasting your day, etc. I don't need to go into that at length. But what it made me think about, and I thank Senator Paris for indicating that these have to be reputable entities as well, up to date with their taxes, registered, all the rest of it. But there's one slight concern that came into my head, which is a complaint that I hear from people quite often, which is that certain entities tend to get specific things, permissions, etc., to do work for the government. So I would just raise a caution that in providing this expansion, which allows for people to have vehicles inspected at a number of places, that those responsible for administering this make sure that it is administered in a way that allow for large as well as small entities to be involved in this. Well-known entities as well as some that may be less well-known, so that there are no accusations of the regular suspects and the same sorts of individuals and companies continuing to be authorized to do certain types of work that can be lucrative, because people need to get their vehicles inspected, and these entities are not going to be doing it for free. So this is a new area of business that some may be able to profit from. So this is not a criticism of the legislation. It is just a caution to those who are implementing it to make sure, as far as is possible, and I believe that it is possible, that these kinds of accusations do not arise, that it is only certain types of businesses and private individuals, certain groups of people who are well-known or who have some connections. We don't want any accusations of political connections or otherwise family ties being responsible for certain garages or certain private individuals being authorized to do inspections. So, you know, our regular cry in here for a level of transparency when it comes to things such as the criteria, why some will be selected and why others will not be selected, to ensure that people have confidence in this system. Not confidence that the vehicles will be appropriately inspected, because I believe we have sufficient mechanics and garages across this island who can do this effectively, but that those who are given permission to do so are not given out of certain favors, favoritism, and all of the other things that we know can occur in this society. And with those very few words, Mr. President, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Haynes. Senator Dr. Haynes.
Thank you for recognizing me, Mr. President. I just wanted to raise briefly to speak to the component of the amendment that addresses the extension of the driver's age requirement for medical certification. I am standing to agree with my medical colleague, Dr. Maynard, on the other side. I have the privilege of working having worked in ophthalmology for several years, working with elderly patients with glaucoma, with cataracts, we know all of the changes that happen in terms of our physical deterioration, cognitive deterioration, response time, all of these things that naturally occur with age. But at the same time, we also know that there is data that speaks to the social isolation, the depression, the likelihood that if you take away an elderly person's driver's license, that they're more likely to end up in a care facility. The fact that within 3 to 4 years of having your driver's license taken away, that you're actually at greater risk of dying than if you're able to maintain your independence, your liberty, your freedom. So I could understand why their representative body, the Barbados Association of Retired Persons, would have approached the government to lobby on behalf of their constituents to ensure that elderly drivers could continue to do so in as safe a way as possible. I was made to understand that both BARP and BAMP, the Barbados Association of Medical Practitioners, would have been able to have an opportunity to give their input on these amendments that are before us today. One of the things that I would like to say is that in examining the data globally, the highest risk for fatality among, or the greatest number of road accidents are actually caused by teenage or newer drivers, not actually the elderly. It's not until about age 85 that the numbers then start to become on par with teenage drivers. Elderly drivers are actually some of our safer drivers. They stay within speed limits, they drive with their seatbelts on. The reality is that they might only have to leave home to go to the supermarket or to go to a healthcare check. So I am really happy to support these specific amendments. I too share Senator Maynard's concern about the use of medical, but I'm understanding that we might see some changes on that regard. I wanted to speak further though to the opportunity to look at perhaps looking at the creation of a specific set of guidelines that would give medical practitioners specific guidance for specific categories of drivers. I have had circumstances working in ophthalmology where you have patients in their 30s and 40s with glaucoma operating commercial vehicles, operating public service vehicles. I had a specific case that had to go to the hospital's ethics board because we were hamstrung, because the legislation basically didn't give us the freedom to tell this specific individual, you cannot drive this bus full of people, even though your visual capacity to safely operate this vehicle by international standards wouldn't have been good enough. So I think that there's opportunity for us going forward, perhaps as we look at the Road Traffic Act more widely to consider guidance. There's the DVLA in the UK has a 132-page book of guidance specifically giving outlines for medical practitioners on how to approach which categories of drivers have to see an ear, nose, and throat specialist for hearing assessment, who needs to see who needs to have a mini mental state test to rule out cognitive impairment, who needs visual field analysis, not just visual acuity where you're talking about 20/20, but assessing whether they can see someone stepping off of a sidewalk. Those are the kinds of assessments that I think could really add value in terms of improving road safety, not just for the elderly, but for road users in generally, particularly for people who are operating public service vehicles and commercial and heavyweight vehicles. And I'm going to leave it there. I think that the debate was pretty fulsome. Thank you for recognizing me.
Thank you very much, Senator. Ready? Her Honor, Senator Thompson.
We're not testing the forgetfulness of the president.
I didn't forget.
Sorry, sir. I want to pick up at the point at which Senator Haynes concluded, and I think that when she talked about visual challenges, she is indeed right. The Honourable Senator is indeed right because of the number of people suffering from diabetes and related challenges, that it isn't just elderly people who have serious visual defects. I mean, I've worn glasses since I was about 8 years old, so I really understand what it is like to be visually impaired. though not as significantly as others. I just want to make a few remarks in respect of this legislation. It is my responsibility to support it, and indeed I'm doing so. But I do have some concerns. We are, in some instances, extending the period during which people of a certain age are going to be reviewed to determine their suitability to drive. And we are allowing for greater latitude on the grounds that the majority of accidents tend not to be within their age groups. And I just wonder if the analysis was done on absolute numbers or on ratios of age cohorts within the demographic of drivers, of people with licenses, to really determine what the percentage of accidents was within any particular age cohort. So when I hear people speak about it is not that category that is doing that, when you have a category that is very wide or a field that is very wide, then you have to do proportionate numbers within that field to make determinations about degrees of risk and so on. Just making that observation to start with. The second observation that I would wish to make is that I have a little bit of concern about extending these periods in order to, because it is difficult for them to stand in lanes and so on. I think what we need to do is to develop mechanisms where they are seen first when they get to licensing authority, where they don't have to stand in line all day, where they are given priority treatment, because, you know, up there they just field you and leave you standing, and if you make the mistake of asking any questions, the security guards can be very dismissive. And, you know, I could regale you with stories of my own experiences standing in the line there, but I shan't do so today. But to give the rationale for my concern, clearly I do want to see them more comfortable and properly serviced. But my concern is that illness and deterioration therefrom, the loss of visual or other acuity, can happen very rapidly when you're over a certain age. And therefore, rather than extending the time, I wonder, because they can be given up to 2 years, and I don't know that that really is prudent given the degree of health risks which increase with age. So I'm just, like I said, it's my responsibility to support the legislation, and I will. But that is one concern. The second concern that I have is the reference, and Senator Maynard has already raised it, the reference to physical fitness, because it is entirely possible that those with dementia, a range of physical illnesses impairing the mind, having not just defects of body, but defects of reasoning or understanding that make them unsuitable to drive, but who are perfectly physically fit. Their vision is excellent. They can hear better than I can. They walk very fast. My father at 90 could have walked faster than I could. I could not catch him, but that did not mean that he was entirely fit to drive, though he insisted that he was. There is a former member of this chamber who has given stories with those in the Barbados Labour Party of the fact that after a while their father was insistent on driving and tested physically fit and having the capacity to drive, but did not appreciate and refused to accept that there were now one-way streets in Bridgetown that you could not drive in a particular direction on. So very often they were determinedly going east or west when the traffic was headed in the other direction, and they would not yield because they said, I have driven up this road all my life. What are y'all doing going in the wrong direction? Perfectly physically fit, hearing very well all the abuses being thrown at them for going in the wrong direction and so on. And as usual, while I'm introducing the issue with some degree of levity, you will appreciate that I'm here making a case for some inclusion or some sensitivity within the legislation that people can be perfectly physically fit to drive, but be mentally unsuitable and a risk to themselves and others to be on the road. And one can think of people with dementia, one with defects of reasoning or defects of the mind that make them unsuitable drivers. So we have to look at the legislation, including that degree of analysis, or we have to amend or take out to ensure that we cover that, because it is a problem. And I just wanted to put that on the record. In addition to, as I said earlier, the degree of time that it takes before we do analyses, up to 1 or 2 years in an age cohort where we know people can break down very, very quickly. Sometimes with elderly people, I mean, it can happen with younger people as well. I'm not suggesting otherwise, but the age group that the legislation is targeting is those who one day they look perfectly well, and within 48 hours they have very, very serious defects. And some of them will still get up and want to drive, because I can tell you, as a person, a child who had to deal with elderly and aging parents and other relatives, the loss of independence and the fear of loss of independence is acute. And very often they either do not realize their own defects and deficiencies, or they are denying them because they want to take themselves to the supermarket or visit a friend or do something or just get away from you. You know, and they're determined to do it. And therefore, you can't stop them from driving, even when they should be stopped. In the instance which I cited earlier, the instance with the former member's parent, the child who was a member of this and the lower chamber actually went to the commissioner of police and asked that the father's license should be withdrawn. But not a lot of parents are going to do that. The children are going to throw up their hands and complain to each other, complain to friends. Meanwhile, daddy is heading the wrong way on Broad Street, waving at friends, thinking that people who are waving at him and telling him to turn around are actually shouting him and saying hello and so on. So, you know, we really have to be very conscious of these risks. I'm not going to get into taxation issues of people 85 and over, whether they should be taxed or not. But since there's a lot of longevity in my family and I may well be headed there, I'm with you all the way, Senator. One other issue to which I want to speak, and I'm moving then because I'm raising just a few issues. I'm not speaking on a broad theme. I'm raising a few issues under the general ambit of the legislation before us. Another one to which I would like to turn then is, and again, I'm going to be very anecdotal, as you know, I want to be. This morning, I was on my way here, sir, and was that last night? Can't remember. See what I tell you what defensive reason. Yeah, it's a bit problematic. No, my license is good. I'm physically fit, sir. So I was headed around a roundabout to go in a particular direction. I assumed that an 18-wheeler, they're 18 or 16-wheelers, one of them big things, sir. Thank you, 16, was coming very quickly, and I thought it was going to go straight, so of course I started to head, and the 18-wheeler turned around the roundabout and came in the same direction that I was headed. Oh, thankfully I had good acceleration, so, you know, it was not a challenge, but it raises for me a wider issue, which is this. And I don't know if anybody else has noticed it. Again, a couple weeks ago, I was going up University Hill, and a 16-wheeler came up the road very quickly. The red light, the light turned red, I stopped, other vehicles stopped. The light had turned red so long that the vehicle that was coming from Hines Hillside was already halfway through their green light when the 18-wheeler just went, 16-wheeler, sorry, just went blowing by. And the traffic on that side, because at least 3 cars had come through the light, it had turned so long, the 3 cars had to brake in order to avoid a collision. Well, I simply picked up my cell phone, sorry, no, I used the Bluetooth to call the owner of the company of that vehicle to say, dear friend of long standing, you vehicle number so nearly just right off 3 motor cars, and I gave the scenario at length, and we had a very pleasant chat. It raises though from your wider issue. I don't know if anybody else has noticed it. We're becoming a lot more busy, a lot more commercialized. There's a lot of commercial activity going on. I hear that we are to have the largest GDP ever this year. Great GDP ever this year, fantastic. But I'm also noticing an increase in the number of heavy-duty vehicles, commercial vehicles, very, very large vehicles, 16-wheelers on the roads. And I think that we are going to have to look at building some kind of bypass roads for them, regulating the hours at which they can travel. We have to, the speed at which they can travel, bearing in mind that these heavy vehicles have a much longer braking time than regular vehicles, particularly when they're carrying loads. And they are built for long distance driving, whereas our roads tend to be narrow. As you go from here to there, there's a traffic light or roundabout, so you're really driving shorter bursts, shorter distances, which these vehicles are not built for. The other thing that I question about them is whether or not there is any examination at all of the weight of these vehicles, not to give the weight certificate, but to determine whether the weight of some of them, which are clearly not built for our road size, are suited, if our capacity is suited to carry such a large number of these vehicles, or whether them is the ones helping to break down the roads and put in all the potholes, etc. No, sir, I mean, yes, I'm bursting water pipes and gas mains and other things. No, I'm being mischievous, I'm playful, but I think the Senate is taking the point that we are having a larger number of these extremely heavy vehicles. Nobody knows how many they have. We are not controlling the times at which they travel. We are not controlling their speeds or making sure that they're going at smaller speeds. We don't know if some of them are in excess of the weight our roads are built to carry, because our roads are built to carry vehicles, I imagine, of a certain size and weight. When you travel outside of Barbados, you go to places, you will see signs that tell you no entry to vehicles over X tons or over X weight, no entry to vehicles over a particular height, etc. So what weight capacity can our roads carry? And are these heavy commercial vehicles, which I'm seeing speeding around in larger numbers, suited to our roads, or whether we should start to look at restrictions? I know those in business, Kadir, are going to tell me about how important the business sector is and the possible impacts and all the good that they do and so on. And I would not want to act as a restraint on commercial activity, but I do want to make the point that this is something of which we have to be cognizant, and this kind of legislation is exactly the space where we should be taking account of an issue like this. I think, sir, that in terms of the notes that I made, that really does conclude the notes that I made, but I think I've made 4 or 5 points on a number of different issues. I did say it would be a brief intervention. 4 or 5 points on different issues which this legislation, I think, if not today, needs a further look at in the future in order to properly encompass, because it is critical to the issue of good, the sustainability of the transport system, the safety of those using it, and to just having a well-regulated system where risks, dangers, and unsafety are all minimized. So with that, sir, I am much obliged to you.
Thank you, Her Honor, Senator Thompson. For the next speaker, let me acknowledge the presence of a colleague from Jamaica, Senator Shireen Golden Campbell, who is a member of the Senate of Jamaica representing the governing party. Welcome to Barbados, and welcome to the Honorable the Senate of Barbados. We're happy to have you. Senator Dr. Monroe Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm very cognizant as I look at the leader of government business that I'm standing between the Senate and lunch. But I'm not, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. I will look at you, Mr. President. Mr. President, these amendments to the Road Traffic Act, as again, what have been indicated by the leader of government business, I think has to be taken in the overall frame of government's mission transformation agenda. That agenda, as we've discussed, that is about deconstruction and reconstruction. An attempt by this government to be responsive, to hear. Actually, Mr. President, I will use the phrase that the Prime Minister uses, to see and feel people, and to have that sentiment reflected in the way that we do business. Essentially, that notion of mission transformation and deconstruction and reconstruction is about looking at across all government departments at all levels of operation, even at the administrative level, and asking ourselves a set of questions about what is it that we need to do differently in order to increase efficiency? Is there a technological fix that can be applied to this problem, this challenge, this issue, or the way that we do whatever it is in terms of this process? And it would mean, Mr. President, a slew of changes that we would see implemented, again, at all levels. Some at policy, and like this one, at the legislative level. Because in the context of that mission transformation agenda, for us, nothing is off the table. Nothing is off the table. It is about change, not only when we talk about the ease of doing business, because I think that when we use that term, sometimes we lose people, and we think about it only, Mr. President, as it relates to capital, but also about being responsive to average Barbadians who just want somebody to pick up the phone, who just want not to have to stand in the line long, who just want to get the service that the government's supposed to give them. That is essentially what mission transformation is about. Mr. President, so serious is this government about this mission transformation that within the public service, the head of the public service has been tasked with the primary responsibility of shepherding that process. So we have someone who is accountable, Mr. President, to be able to see that process through. Additionally, the Prime Minister herself chairs meetings with ministers, permanent secretaries, officers of related grades, at which we have to account for the progress that we have made as we move on that road of mission transformation, so that we are attempting to build in accountability into the process. Importantly, Mr. President, I also want to say that when we talk about efficiency gains, productivity gains, that we also have to look at another part of the equation. There is literature that suggests, Mr. President, that when we talk about wait times, that there's also an issue of equity and equality. Research suggests that the agency that we have in terms of our decisions about how we spend time sometimes is not always arbitrated fairly because of social positioning. This study that was done by Halt and Vinopal suggests that economic and social inequities create inequities in our autonomy over our own time, and that disadvantaged groups pay a higher price for services in the form of their time. They suggest that waiting in line is not the only example of what they call income-related inequity. Essentially, persons in the higher income bracket can afford sometimes not to wait, Mr. President. They can afford to pay somebody else to wait for them. They can afford, Mr. President, to use private services that are perhaps seen as more efficient, and therefore they are able to gain time, whereas those that do not have a choice have to continue to stand in line and wait, therefore creating that inequity. So the issue of creating efficiencies in this way is, yes, about the productivity gains, but as well making sure that we can continue to have equality in the way that we provide services for our citizens, which is extremely important. Mr. President, one of the other aspects that I want to speak about in the context of this mission transformation that we are on, and even in the context of these amendments, is that the government is going even further. That just saying, yes, we have to be able to improve on the wait times, but as you would have heard the Prime Minister announce, we're also intending to have a customer service call center in order to allow citizens to be able to call in and speak to government about their perceptions, about their complaints with the quality of government services. And that call center is going to be rolled out this month, providing Barbadians with the opportunity to make sure that they can speak to someone, guaranteeing that we will have somebody there who will answer that phone and not only listen to you, but to resolve the complaint. It is part of the broader framework of a grievance redress mechanism intended to ensure that we resolve the challenges that Barbadians have with the quality of customer services. It recognizes that there already exist in some departments call centers and mechanisms, but that they still are not functioning optimally. And therefore, this call center will serve as a central repository for people to be able to call and, like I said, hear someone. And I want to admit, Mr. President, that initially I was not a fan. I was of the view, that we have a lot of technological solutions, that we can use the WhatsApp, we can use the email, we can use all of the other things. But just I think a couple of days ago, having a meeting with all of the customer service persons and centers within the government, to hear that there is a large demographic, primarily of older persons, who want to talk to somebody, who want to have somebody explain something to them and have somebody listen and resolve. So we will have that call center established, Mr. President, but also as well, yes, use all of the other things, the WhatsApp, the email, to provide for those perhaps like me who would prefer to use that mechanism, but ensure that we cater to that elderly cohort who want to be able to have somebody listen to them and to be able to resolve their concerns. But Mr. President, I think that there is a challenge at hand that we also have to see. Because even as government works to improve its own efficiencies, and particularly as we speak to this amendment and the move to have approved garages now being part of that machinery to help to weigh and to certify vehicles, that they now have a challenge to improve their own service. Mr. President, I believe that we're all aware that there is a perception that what government needs to do in order to fix its process is to go to the private sector. The private sector has it all made, the private sector. We just need to learn from the private sector, copy from the private sector, mimic what the private sector is doing, and then government will be straightened. And in the context of this particular amendment, we have to be able to make sure, I think as was said previously, that these same private garages can then operate at the level of efficiency that is required. Mr. President, I have gone to pay my car insurance at a company and having to stand up sometime in crowded corridors, stand up not sure what happening here, wait for the body to turn up to do the inspection for the car for however long time, wait in line for the cashier, who is sometimes just as disgruntled as the perception is of the people in the public service, who face just as set up as people in the public service, and who can also make mistakes. So I'm also saying, Mr. President, that even as we do this, there is then a responsibility placed on those private garages to make sure that they can be responsive to the public that will come to them, not only on the transparency end as we've heard, but also as well in relation to how they efficiently provide that service to the public as well. And I think one of the things that we have to do is to make sure that we also monitor that end, that we are creating that efficiency in terms of allowing now the Barbados Licensing Authority to be able to focus on a particular set of tasks, creating productivity gains around there, and then allowing them to offer optimal service. But as we make that transition, that also as well that we monitor what is happening with the private garages. Mr. President, we have seen already that government is making strides in relation to offering for our services. I believe that we can all attest to the improvements already that have been made at the Immigration Department, Mr. President. Kudos is always given to that particular department. People talk about the police certificate of character and how that has changed. If we look at Easy Pay, Mr. President, I went on to Easy Pay this morning, and the number of services that you can now go online and pay for, including your license, your driver's license, on the Easy Pay platform. Taxes, Mr. President, pay on the Easy Pay tax form, even contributions to inmates on the government Easy Pay tax platform. And there are, Mr. President, plans as well to continue to expand that. I remember when I was at the Barbados Licensing Authority, that we made provision that people could pay their license through the Easy Pay platform. Again, the ease of doing business. So that this process of government moving to create efficiencies like the one that we are debating within this amendment is something that this government is committed to, will continue to roll out, and you will see department by department the creation of those efficiencies. Government is moving to digitize all of its records, Mr. President. As a minister, I tell my staff, I do not sign off on paper records. I'm sorry. Do not send a file to me to sign off. I understand that that is a tradition. But I will do that using a digital solution in order to be able to still meet the same metrics in terms of accountability. So that we are committed to that task of creating the necessary productivity and efficiency gains under mission transformation. And we want to, Mr. President, assure the public that like this particular amendment here, that you will see other policy initiatives coming from this government that will ensure that we, again, Mr. President, see and feel people. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Senator Kevin Moyes.
Thank you, Mr. President. My apologies to my colleagues. I had to be somewhere else, but I also made sure I was back here. And I know the leader of government business, even though the reach does not extend to those of us who hold sway the independent banner so high, insists that you're here to do a job, so be here to make your contribution as necessary. With that aside, sir, I think it's important for any such debate as we find ourselves to look at the historical context or the history of the Road Traffic Act since 2018. We were here, sir, in different capacities, different components, but still one body, the Senate, even though there's a legal argument as to whether we are constituted, but I guess that will be resolved eventually, sir. We were here previously in 2018, where the first time the government took upon the mantle to keep in line with its policy objective was to abolish the road tax. There was then, I believe, sir, a return in 2018 as well, where we dealt with the issue of registration numbers, and I think it was referenced by the leader of government business, the issue of stickers, and the fact that there were different stickers for different categories. That prompted a number of questions, sir, which were dealt with somewhat abruptly in another place. But I think that it goes to show that while we may have the best intentions with regard to implementing new policies and measures, we need to be somewhat cognizant of the reality where we find ourselves. And that while we may say it seems so simple, the actual proof of the pudding remains within the eating, sir. Or as I like to say, the proof of the sauce is in the mouth. But my friends tell me that has not been caught catching on, but I keep trying to repeat it. So eventually it may become a euphemism. The point being is this, sir. The issue maybe of the stickers, which I was behind one today trying to get here back to make my contribution, and it said June 2022. It was right there, you know, it's right there. All of us have the stickers with the date, which have not been replaced. And maybe, sir, it was impacted by COVID. Maybe it was part of the supply chain, but life happens. And it's interesting when I hear the Honorable Senator Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight push the need for digitization, which is true. We, however, have to have a redundancy for the reality in which we find ourselves. I, for one, am a big proponent of digitization. My team will tell you I speak about scanning. However, those of us who are in the courts have found ourselves recently where we were unable to continue certain trials because the Wi-Fi was not working. We therefore had to revert to going there in person. So while we always push for digitization, we need to ensure that we have the built-in redundancies for life. That being said, sir, we also did further amendment in 2021 to the Road Traffic Act for the production of identification when stopped by members of the Barbados Police Force to show that you are who you say you are. Service, to say you are who you say you are. And then, of course, there was another amendment in 2022 to validate certain heavy-duty permits which were issued between 2017 to 2022 to do with the heavy-duty licenses. So this legislation is one which I think all members of this House are somewhat familiar with in different aspects and pieces. Now, the issue which we find ourselves here today, no issue whatsoever, the concept of privately owned garages and the issue of pushing the age limit. I listened with interest to the contributions of the members of the Senate, in particularly the Deputy President, who I think made a number of statements which I believe will be prudently considered by the Cabinet with regard to the concerns about the age and what happens to us all when we reach a certain place. The other issue, sir, which I found somewhat more interesting is the concept of private garages for the purpose of doing the verification process. Now, it is correct that MTW is unwieldy, perhaps may be the best word to describe it in terms of how it operates, and certainly the number of vehicles which is required to process. The concept of creating satellites or privately owned garages to do or provide assistance with this job makes sense. What we have, however, learned, perhaps the hard way, sir, is that if there's opportunity for persons to take advantage of government largesse, it would occur. So the question is, what checks and balances will be implemented for these garages? The legislation contemplates that the minister is the one responsible. That's what it says. So maybe the leader of government business will say whether there's a board or a committee or someone or somebody which has oversight in relation to these garages. Secondly, sir, not just oversight in terms of selection, because that could be a longer topic, but we have lunch coming out in that will we see the same names coming up as now owners of garages? Or would there be a certain segment of garages which will follow the line of the co-op which we have providing service for our buses? Would there be garages to be drawn from the communities to provide this service? I guess time will tell, and I'm sure the leader of government business will address if that has been considered. Besides the policing, sir, of one, the selection, and two, the operation of the garages, the other question has to be, of course, how do we ensure the garages have the necessary sophistication to do their job? What are the requirements with regard to the qualification and the certification of persons who will be doing the checks and balances? I'm aware that in other jurisdictions, it's not just simply a question of roadworthiness and weight, but also the question of emissions. I know we haven't reached there yet as a country. We are pushing steadfastly towards our 2030 goal, and we recognize that as a low pollutant country, it may be a bit harsh for us to say that our vehicles should have low emissions. However, the counter side to that is, well, if the vehicles are not good for other jurisdictions, why are they good for ours? However, the cost of the vehicle with less emissions also has to be considered, so government has to do the balancing act. However, in doing such balancing, in doing such certification, in doing such roadworthiness consideration, are we going to be considering the environmental impact of such vehicles in the future? Coming on from these debates, sir, and it wasn't necessarily in the Road Traffic Act, I believe it was in the debate which spoke to the utilization of EV vehicles, Senator Malilu has raised the question of infrastructure. And I would say, sir, that I'm a recent convert to the concept of renewable energy and the sun. You know, I was like, but I really have begun to see the light. Is all that there? Okay. So I've begun to see the light in terms of the utilization of alternate forms of energy. And when you realize the potential which it has, the question, of course, is the infrastructural cost to take advantage of it. And as a small island development state, we recognize that there are certain restrictions on us. However, sir, when we are having these debates about road traffic, and when we're having these debates about road traffic garages, perhaps it's also something to consider for the future, whether these garages would have the necessary sophistication to deal with the challenges of EV vehicles, their fueling, their maintenance, and their consideration. I believe that Senator Malilu had raised the issue of concerns with regard to our protective services having the necessary tools to deal with fires in electronic vehicles. So all these are factors which ought to be considered in the debate, which, well, certainly grounded, perhaps when we get granular. My team tells me that I'm a bit granular, sir. When we get granular with regard to how the garages are rolled out, these are considerations which could be implemented for their utilization. Now, sir, in terms of the digitization process and the current activity within the MTW, I was required recently to change vehicles, and it was interesting to see that, you know, sometimes the more things change, the more they stay the same. So let me give you the positive. During COVID, I believe I was able to renew my license. I think the Minister of Home Affairs was on TV talking about it, and you go on and you do your digital stuff, and my license came in the mail, so that was very impressive. So you see the upside of digitization. However, the process of renewing my vehicle, or the new vehicle, took a very interesting turn in that because of the digitization requirements and the stuff that was required to be uploaded into the new system, it took longer than it previously did. Now, I recognize this is purely anecdotal and doesn't constitute a scientific survey, but in our need to push for digitization, we need to recognize that digitization requires a certain level of sophistication, a certain level of resources, because you still have to have persons who are taking that information, processing it, and getting the necessary results. So while you do have a better record, unless you have the manpower and resources to utilize it, you then find yourself with similar delays as going and sign up with a piece of paper, waiting to get your license number, waiting to get it stamped, and going through the process. That's just an observation, sir. Another issue which stems from the digitization, and another personal reference, is that the there is now built within the TAMIS in terms of the income tax confines, and I heard the leader of government business speak about his C-plates. I like them very much. And there is this, perhaps when the system was created, let me digress a bit, in that the concept of the C-plate, we also, passed that legislation back in 2018 with the different categories of license plates. C was one of them, sir. Anyway, subsequent. The point is, with the category of C-plate, it's supposed to be a commercial vehicle. However, there seemed to be a period where a C-plate was automatically assigned to any vehicle which was owned by a company, which then led to some difficulties where directors were using the vehicle for their personal needs, but it had to have a C-plate. But I understand that issue has been resolved. Now, while the issue was resolved through whatever purpose or mechanism, there still is now a linkage in TAMIS. So when you go to do your corporation tax in TAMIS, there's a line item, number 62, which says, please put in the value of your vehicle, which cannot be less than $75,000. And if you have a holding company which doesn't have a vehicle, you can't get past it. And this has been reported, but again, these are all teething problems, but they're all what occur when you have a system which you're unaware of the different input factors which then cause resulting issues. So it's something to be aware of. I understand, sir, and let's get a bit historic. We all know that Bajans and good malicious Bajans like to know your license plate, because I can look at your license plate and say, this is an X car, I'm in St. John, you are not from around here, correct? And we all know that as good Bajans, we would know your license plate, but we would not know your name. That's XB231, that's XB, so you know the license plate. What has happened because of this new system is that because the company owns the vehicle, or the company where you lease the vehicle from owns the vehicle, all the license plates are now within the jurisdiction of the majority of them are in St. Michael. So the benefit of utilizing a license plate as an identifier to show where you come from is no longer there. Now, I don't know whether that's important for our security services. I know for certain persons who like to peep out, wait, hold on, who is that going by Senator Paris? That, you know what I mean? So you'll be able to see that may be lost. I now have a M license plate, which I intend to take full advantage of for as long as it will last before people get to know it. So that's another change which has come about and is something to consider if we look at what is the purpose of the vehicle identification license plate. Like Senator Thompson, our Deputy President, I'm using humor to bring home the point that maybe this is something that we could refine in the allocation and the identification purposes of the license plate, sir. Sir, the question of permits and licenses in terms of who gets what for what vehicles, I just thought I would mention it because I believe it's a perennial issue, but I understand that there's a board who's been appointed, and I don't know if they are also referenced in the winds of change, which were referenced in earlier speeches. Personally, I think we should not move off of this debate without again touching on the issue of the increased lawlessness on the roads. I think has been dealt with when we spoke about the issues of ZRs, but I don't think it's limited just to public service vehicles. I think we as citizens need to be cognizant of what we do ourselves and be mindful that there was a time where Barbados was known for its orderly conduct. I don't know it's because the prism has changed on my vision now in my 40+ years, things that perhaps didn't bother me in my 20s are suddenly very egregious in my 40s. But it seems to be that there is an increase in lawlessness in terms of how we drive and how we act. Sir, we cannot leave off of this debate without mentioning the issue of the roadworks, which are ongoing. We've been part of this Senate. We have done the $300 million, sorry, for the works in the Scotland district. We were here for the 25 million IDB loan for the work in the other areas of St. George, Sam Lords, and Huddersfield. However, my constituents within the Twitter universe, sir, have been crying out with regard to the roads on Christchurch in relation to Highway 7, and we did see the Deputy Prime Minister speak to the works which plan to happen between Tiki Bar and Tappers, There's, of course, the issue with the flooding in Old Town and the issue with Highway 2A. And we know all that will be dealt with, and the priority seems to be that we're going from outwards inwards. So I'm sure the leader of government business will speak to the issue of the main arteries and where the funding is, because we know we need the money to get that done. All in all, sir, we have listed all the concerns into the legislation. I've given somewhat a historic step-by-step as to the previous amendments that were made, and I look forward to hearing the leader of government business response to these issues, recognizing the collaborative purpose of the contribution. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Senator Kevin Boyce. Senator Cummings, please wrap up.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was not hearing the asides from my colleague about a previous Minister of Public Works who also represented a Christchurch constituency who may or may not have had an opportunity to do some of the work to which my colleague Senator Boyce just referred. I may or may not have heard that comment as a sidebar. But, Mr. President, I want to thank all of the colleagues who have spoken so far on these amendments. Orders number 2 and 3 have obviously evoked the passions of all of my colleagues in a range of areas. And I want to start, first of all, well, Senator Malilu is not here again, but to acknowledge his comments as well in his absence. So too for Senator Dr. Brathwaite, who spoke about the importance of our seniors and what we need to be able to do to facilitate them and to make life in the latter part of their years more amenable. I'm not quite sure we can go as far as he certainly in this place has proposed in terms of the removal of taxes over a certain age, but you know, certainly if I were to live to the ripe old age of 85, I may agree with you at that point. Senator Paris, in her contribution, spoke extensively on the amendments themselves, but she also spoke about 2 important issues relating to signage and pedestrian crossings. I'm going to speak about signage very briefly, just to say that under the Ministry of Transport and Works, there has been an extensive program that has been assigned resources over the course of the financial year at different points to allow for the removal and the replacement of signage across the island. You'll see in different parts of the country, new signs have gone up on the posts, helping to direct you to where you need to go, but there is still work that must be done, and that work is continuing. I do want to make reference to your commentary on the tourism sector being our major foreign exchange earner and the importance of signage there. We are seeing historically, in our earlier resolution, we spoke about the work of various members of the third sector or the private sector, and we do historically have a number of signs that have been provided across the country by the Barbados Hotel and Tourism Association in collaboration with other partners, giving visibility to signage. I expect that that work will continue over time, and we want to see more of that. But just to say that what we have seen coming out of that same sector is that in the absence of that work being completed, we've seen a lot of persons taking it upon themselves to put signage onto public utility posts, directing you to different locations. Where is this building located? Where is this office located? This restaurant, this hotel? That is not legal. And it also helps to create confusion in public signage because people aren't often sure which way you're actually meant to go. And it's something that I know that the Ministry of Transport and Works has been attempting to actively discourage people from doing, but it simply means that the commitment to the upgrading of our signage will continue. And then finally, under the Ministry of Tourism and International Transport, there is a National Tourism Program funded by the Inter-American Development Bank that also has a component for signage specific to the tourism sector. So I want to give the assurance that you are seeing what has been started, but what has not yet been completed. Now, Senator Maynard, I want to thank you for your recommendation. I hope I remember all of the comments that have been made by colleagues, but I give the commitment that if I don't remember everything that you said, I will come back in a subsequent one-on-one to make sure that I have given it my attention. Now, Senator Maynard, you made a recommendation for an amendment to Section 4, Paragraph B of the Order number 2, and you made the recommendation that the language which currently reads as follows: where that person submits a medical certificate to the licensing authority signed by a medical practitioner As to that person's physical fitness and so on, the recommendation was made by yourself and by Senator Dr. Crystal Haynes that the language was perhaps a little bit too narrow or perhaps too specific, and it needed to allow for different types of acuity. I like the word used by Senator Haynes. And so on that basis, we would wish to propose an amendment, and we'll do so in committee when we get to that point, taking your recommendation into consideration. Just to make the point at this stage, however, that it is easy in this forum, at this level, in the Senate, and certainly at the committee level, to make changes that are non-substantive. And I want to make it clear that when the government does not find itself in a position to agree to amendments made here, it means that it's a result of consequential amendments that will be made elsewhere in the legislation. In this instance, that does not apply, and we've taken the point. It does not affect the legislation more broadly, and it doesn't affect the drafters more broadly, and so we have no difficulty taking that amendment into consideration. And I want to thank you and the colleagues for making the recommendation. Now, Senator Haynes also in a typically strong medical contribution spoke about the kinds of things that are being taken into consideration, and it gave strength to the points raised by Senator Paris as well as Dr. Maynard on the issue of pedestrian crossings and what was needed. It's important, Mr. President, to make the point here that as we talk about the work of the National Disabilities Commission, that a person who is visually impaired, for example, or who is hearing impaired, they have different needs. And having a society that is inclusive, even at the level of pedestrian crossings in ways that we may not have spoken about it before, being able to see a flashing light, hear a sound that tells them that there's oncoming traffic, and also to treat to how we get people to slow down coming out of those roundabouts and approaching pedestrian crossings. All of those things are important and critical, and I thank the colleagues for raising them. Senator Haynes, Senator Thompson, in her contribution, which was very much welcome. Before I do that, actually, let me make the point about road users generally. It was raised by several persons, Senator Dr. Hines, Senator Paris, and others about road users and indiscipline in our roads. Also, Senator John King also in his contribution spoke about that. There are also a couple of pieces of legislation that we have in this chamber amended over time. This Road Traffic Act is in need, as is the case with so many other pieces of our legislation, of a complete overhaul. That's the work of the Law Review Commission, headed by Sir David Simmons, and the expectation is that over time, we will see comprehensive overhauling of specific pieces of legislation. In my own ministry, for example, I believe I've spoken about the Companies Act, which has been tinkered with multiple times, and Senator Boyce, Kevin this time, is a classic example in his own discipline in the law, would know that this is something that has happened over multiple incarnations. The Road Traffic Act is another one of those pieces of legislation that we ourselves between 2018 and now have been in this honorable chamber and amended in multiple respects, multiple times. That includes, Mr. President, simple things like the use of cell phones that we have completely lost sight of. How many times do we see people on the road now with their cell phones in their hands and boldly to their ears? There was a time when we in this chamber made amendments to the law to make that illegal. For that to be in a space where now, Mr. President, we're no longer seeing people more widely using the Bluetooth, as Senator Thompson said earlier, using the car phone or pulling off to the side of the road, stopping, putting the car in a park position. If you have to make or take a call, it's not happening anymore. That speaks to the broader question of discipline, or rather indiscipline in our road. We've changed legislation over time, Mr. President, about children under a certain age being restrained in the rear of the car. How many times are we seeing people who are having children sitting in the middle of the car in the back seat? If you stop, that child becomes a missile, and that child goes flying through the windscreen, and you have a tragedy on your hands. We need to return to the discipline, not just in the PSV sector, but in private vehicles as well, where we do the right things and are safe as we use our roads, Mr. President. Now, Senator Boyce, in his closing commentary, raised a number of issues. I've already treated to the comprehensive overview of the road traffic legislation overall. I also want to make the point about the digitization and to take the point raised by both yourself and Senator Dr. Monroe Knight when you spoke about digitization. What we have seen is that digitization is far more than scanning of a document and uploading of a document to a platform, which inevitably, certainly in my own ministry, in agencies like KIPO, you find that persons then print off and send to me on a file for approval, even though it has been digitized in one way. But at the same time, when you talk about scanning, you're talking not just about scanning of a document, the digitalization process, which allows me to interact with and deal with a form and give approvals in a format and on a platform that is genuinely digital. So no part of it needs to come off of the digital platform, and you're able to interface with the system effectively. All of those are things that are critical, not just at the front end, but the provision of adequate and up-to-date resources on the back end that make these systems usable and practical in ways that benefit ordinary Barbadians. But also there's that balance, right? We are making the amendment to the legislation to allow for persons over 75 years not to have to come every 2 years and over 85 years to come every 1 year. But digitalization and technology platforms are not ideal for certain persons over a certain demographic. I don't know about the rest of my colleagues, but I know that my mother, who is 76 years old, calls me every day. I cannot figure out how this woman manages to press the wrong buttons on her phone or press the wrong buttons on the remote control every single day. I don't know how. I am constantly troubleshooting things that I don't know how she got there. And she said, but come. I'm like, what happened now? How did you get here? So technology isn't always a friend, but I take the point. Persons who are retired, they are in some instances living their best lives. They're involved in their churches, they're involved in their community clubs, they're busier sometimes in their social lives than me. And they can never be found at home. You can't get them on the phone. They always have somebody from morning. Before I leave home on the morning, the phone is ringing. And when I get home on the evenings, I probably don't even get a chance to say hello to her because she's talking to somebody or some group has a Zoom call. They're busy. So the idea of us making sure that they're living their best lives while simultaneously interacting with the system in a way that makes life easier for them is an absolute point of importance for this as a government. And so, Mr. President, I in closing, want to thank all of the colleagues for their contributions and their recommendations, and I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
And we are pushing through. Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do not leave the chair. The Senate dissolves itself into committee for further deliberation of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair, and the Honorable the Senate resolve itself into committee for further consideration of this bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it.
The Honorable the Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 1 stand part.
The question is that clause 1 do now stand part. Will all honorable members in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 2.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 2 do now stand part.
The question is that clause 2 do now stand part. Will all honorable members in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Clause 3.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 3 do now stand part.
The question is that clause 3 do now stand part. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Aye. Those against, would you please say no? The ayes have it.
Clause 4.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 4 do now stand part.
The question is...
Amendment, please.
Question. Clause 4 as amended.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clause 4 do now stand par as amended, and for clarity, the
No,
amendment.
you need to put the amendment first.
And for clarity, I'm giving the amendment at paragraph clause 4. We have the final paragraph in B, where that person submits a medical certificate to the licensing authority signed by a medical practitioner as to that person's physical fitness, that the paragraph be amended to read as follows. Where that person submits a medical certificate to the licensing authority signed by a medical practitioner as to that person's fitness. The word physical is being proposed for deletion.
The question is that clause 4 as amended to delete the word physical do not pass. All honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Report.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do not report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee as amended. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The President has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee as amended. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. I think the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Road Traffic Amendment Act 2023.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Road Traffic Amendment Act 2023. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited.
Mr. President, just for clarity, this bill will be sent back to the Lower House with the amended message, but it's passed and then gone.
So noted.
Order number 3, sir. In the name of the Honorable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Road Traffic Registration Fees Order 2018 Validation Bill 2023.
Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the... I beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honor do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into committee for further deliberation of this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honorable the Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. We think the ayes have it.
The Senate is now in committee.
Clauses 1 and 2.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that clauses 1 and 2 stand part.
The question is that clauses 1 and 2 do now stand part. All honorable members in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Report.
Madam Chair, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honor the President the passage of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honor the President the passing of one bill in committee. Will all honorable senators in favor please say aye? Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a third time.
The question is that this bill be read a third time. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Road Traffic Registration Fees Order 2018 Validation Act 2023.
The question is that this bill do not pass and be cited as the Road Traffic Registration Fees Order 2018 Validation Act 2023. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now passed and so cited. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And before we close, I'd like to thank all of the honorable colleagues for their contributions today. And I beg to move that the Senate now be adjourned sine die.
The question is that the Senate do now adjourn sine die. Honorable senators in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Senate stands adjourned sine die.